They said money couldn't buy respect, but for Charles Bennett, respect was never about money. It was about dignity. About how people looked at him when he pushed a mop down the glossy marble halls of Grayson corporate towers. About the way eyes slid past him like he didn't exist. He had learned long ago that people didn't see the man, they saw the uniform, the gloves, the broom. They saw the janitor. And in that building full of polished shoes and glass offices, no one looked down on him more than Helen. Helen Carter, the executive assistant to the CEO. She moved through the halls like she owned them, perfume sharp enough to cut glass, heels clicking like a countdown to someone's humiliation. To her, anyone not wearing a suit was invisible. But that morning, when Charles was quietly scrubbing a coffee stain from the lobby floor, Helen decided invisibility wasn't enough. She wanted to make him small. She sauntered past, pretending not to see him, then with a deliberate kick, sent his mop bucket crashing over, water spreading across the pristine floor. "Oh no," she said, feigning shock, her red lips curling into a smirk, "did I ruin your masterpiece?" Laughter rippled from 3 interns nearby, unsure whether to laugh or hide. Charles said nothing. Just steadied the bucket and began wiping again. That silence only fueled her cruelty. She leaned close, voice dripping with venom, "It must be sad, cleaning up after people who actually matter. Don't you ever wish you were more than this?" She flicked her wrist like she was brushing away dust, and walked off, laughter echoing behind her. Charles didn't look up. Didn't curse. Didn't defend himself. Because years ago, when he first started, he had believed her words. He had felt small. But what Helen didn't know, what nobody in that tower knew, was that Charles Bennett owned more of that building than the CEO she worshipped. The janitor was one of the largest private investors in Grayson Towers, a silent millionaire who had turned hard work into empire. Real estate, stock portfolios, and companies that others never knew had his name behind them. He came to work not for a paycheck, but for perspective. To stay grounded. To remember where he came from. But that day, Helen's arrogance reminded him, some people still had lessons to learn. A week later, the company buzzed with excitement. The CEO was hosting a high-profile investor luncheon. Executives scrambled, assistants panicked, and Helen bragged loudly that she was in charge of the seating chart. "Only the important people sit up front," she said, smirking at Charles as he swept the hallway. "And some people will always be in the back where they belong." He smiled softly, a quiet glimmer in his eyes. Because she didn't know his name was already on that list, under top stakeholders. The day of the luncheon arrived. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers. Laughter, champagne, polished silver, everything that made power look beautiful. Helen floated between tables, inspecting every detail, wearing a dress that screamed authority. Then, from across the room, she saw him. Charles. In his janitor uniform. Carrying a tray of glasses. Her eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "This isn't your place. The kitchen's in the back." People turned to watch. Her voice carried. But Charles only nodded respectfully and continued setting the glasses down. She laughed, shaking her head. Unbelievable. Moments later, the CEO stepped on stage. Applause filled the room. He began introducing the company's top investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," the CEO announced, "please welcome one of our largest private stakeholders, Mr. Charles Bennett." The applause grew louder, and gasps spread like wildfire. Helen's wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor. She stared in disbelief as Charles, now dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, walked to the stage, posture straight, calm, commanding. The same man she'd mocked now walked past executives who scrambled to shake his hand. He took the microphone. The room fell silent. "Many of you know me as the man who keeps your floors clean," he said, voice steady and deep. But few of you know that I also keep your lights on. I've learned that titles, uniforms, and suits don't define worth. Character does. Respect does. And today, I want to remind everyone, treat the janitor with the same respect you treat the CEO. Because you never know who's really signing your paycheck. The silence was heavy, like truth pressing on every chest. Some executives lowered their eyes. Others clapped slowly. And Helen, frozen in her chair, looked like the air had been punched from her lungs. She tried to stand, but everyone's eyes followed her. Everyone knew. The interns who once laughed now stared, ashamed. Afterward, reporters surrounded Charles. Articles flooded social media, the millionaire janitor who taught a company respect. He became a local legend. Inspirational videos, interviews, donations to community centers, his story spread like wildfire. But while the city celebrated his humility, Helen's world collapsed. The CEO quietly demoted her. Colleagues whispered behind her back. Her reputation shattered. And humiliation, for someone like Helen, was poison. She smiled in public, but at night, that smile turned into hate. "He embarrassed me," she muttered over a glass of wine, scrolling through online headlines. "He made me a joke." And with a sharp inhale, she whispered, "Nobody embarrasses Helen Carter," and walks away. Weeks later, Charles noticed something strange. People at the office spoke differently around him. Conversations stopped when he entered. He'd find documents on his desk that he hadn't touched. Whispers. Suspicion. Then came the email, an anonymous accusation to the board, claiming Charles's investments were linked to fraud. At first, it was laughable. But rumors spread fast. Meetings grew tense. People started to doubt. Helen, sitting in her new cubicle far from the executive floor, smirked each time she heard his name. Her plan was working. Soon, online forums erupted. Millionaire janitor or master conman? Headlines twisted his legacy. The same media that once praised him now hunted him. Charles felt the sting, but stayed calm. Truth, he believed, always outlived lies. But as he dug through records, he found something chilling: fake contracts, forged signatures, and digital traces leading back to one name, Helen Carter. She had turned revenge into sabotage. That night, he sat in his mansion study, staring at the evidence, city lights glowing outside. His reflection in the glass was calm, but his resolve was steel. "She wants war," he said quietly. "Then war it will be. But I won't fight with hate, I'll fight with truth." The next morning, Charles walked into Grayson Towers not with a mop, but with a lawyer. He requested an emergency board meeting. Helen sat smugly at the back, pretending to take notes. But when Charles spread the evidence across the table, her confidence cracked. Forged documents, falsified leaks, payments traced to her account. Gasps filled the room. This is a setup," she stammered. No one believed her. The CEO's face turned pale. "Helen Carter," he said firmly, "you're terminated, effective immediately." Security escorted her out as cameras flashed. She passed Charles in the hall, eyes burning with hate. Her lips moved, voice trembling with venom. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." He didn't answer, only watched her go, calm as ever. Because he knew peace was the ultimate power. The media once again turned, headlines roaring. Truth triumphs, millionaire janitor clears his name. His reputation restored. His dignity intact. People cheered. But that night, when Charles returned home, victory felt uneasy. His mansion was silent. Too silent. And then he saw it, a white envelope slid under his door. No stamp. No address. Just his name, written in jagged letters. Inside was a single photograph, his mansion, taken from outside, at night. On the back, in red ink, "You think you've won. But I'm closer than you know." Charles froze. The photo slipped from his hand. His eyes darted to the window. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, but among the shadows, he thought he saw movement. A figure. Watching. Charles thought respect was the only lesson Helen needed to learn. But when humiliation turns to obsession, revenge doesn't die in the boardroom, it follows you home. And as the night deepens, Charles Bennett is about to discover, the war for dignity has just begun. They said revenge dies with silence, but Helen Carter wasn't the kind of woman who knew how to stay quiet. Months had passed since her public humiliation, but bitterness has a way of fermenting in the dark, turning pain into poison. And for Helen, that poison had a name, Charles Bennett. It began with whispers. A shadow in the parking lot. An unfamiliar car following him from work. Charles tried to dismiss it. He told himself paranoia was just the price of being known. But every night, the unease grew louder. The photograph she'd sent him, the one of his mansion, taken from outside, still sat on his desk, a silent reminder that the war wasn't over. One rainy evening, Charles came home to find his front gate open. The air was cold, too still. As he stepped inside, his security system blinked red. Disabled. His heart tightened. He moved carefully through the foyer, calling out, "Who's there?" Silence answered. But then he saw it, a wine glass on the counter, half full. Someone had been here. And beside it, a note, written in the same jagged handwriting as before, "You took my dignity. Now I'll take your peace." Charles exhaled slowly, forcing calm. "So it begins," he murmured. He wasn't afraid, not of Helen, not of anyone. But he knew she was dangerous now, cornered and consumed. That kind of hatred doesn't just fade, it multiplies. He called his lawyer, his security team, the police. But Helen had disappeared, vanished like smoke. No trace. No address. Just rumors that she'd fled the city after her firing. Still, Charles knew better. She was close. Waiting. Weeks passed, and then came the storm. Anonymous tips flooded the media again, claims that Charles's company had unpaid taxes, misused funds, hidden scandals. None were true, but perception is power, and Helen understood that better than anyone. Investors grew restless. The board called emergency meetings. His stock prices dipped. Headlines changed from hero janitor to fallen icon. And while the city gossiped, Helen watched from the shadows, smiling. But Charles Bennett wasn't the kind of man who crumbled under rumor. He had built his empire from nothing, and nothing was exactly what fear made him feel. Late one night, he sat in his study, rain tapping against the glass, and whispered to himself, "If she wants truth to bleed, I'll make sure hers bleeds louder." The next morning, he began quietly digging, not into her past at Grayson, but before it. He hired private investigators, traced aliases, records, old employment files. And soon, the truth came to light. Helen Carter wasn't even her real name. She had changed it years ago after being accused of corporate fraud at a former company, charges that vanished after a mysterious payout. Charles stared at the file, realization settling like ice. "She's been running from the same kind of truth she tried to bury me with," he said. Armed with proof, Charles prepared his move. He didn't want revenge, he wanted closure. But some lessons have to be taught in the open. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The city's Business Integrity Gala, a televised event celebrating ethical leaders. Charles was invited as a keynote speaker. The same media that once mocked him now waited for a redemption speech. And that's when he saw her. Helen. Sitting near the back of the ballroom, dressed in black, sunglasses on despite the dim light, pretending to be invisible. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world stopped moving. Then Charles smiled, not out of malice, but pity. Because he saw it, the desperation behind her glare. When he took the stage, the crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. He began softly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Months ago, I was reminded how fragile reputation can be. One lie, one rumor, one act of arrogance can destroy a lifetime of work. But I learned something greater, that integrity doesn't vanish when people doubt you. It shines through the doubt. He paused, letting the silence hold weight. And tonight, I want to dedicate this speech to those who taught me that lesson the hard way. Gasps whispered through the room as the screens behind him flickered, showing documents, news clippings, and then, Helen's forged records. Her real name. Her past crimes. Everything she had buried now glowing in front of hundreds of eyes. Helen shot up from her chair, face pale, voice breaking, "You can't, this isn't," but it was too late. Security moved in, cameras turned, reporters swarmed. The truth had finally caught her. Charles looked at her as she was led away. "You could have risen," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "But you chose to crawl through lies. Now the only thing left is the truth you tried to bury." She spat the words through tears. "You think you've won? You'll regret this, Bennett. You'll regret every second of this." He turned away, calm as ever, the applause rising behind him, not for revenge, but for redemption. The city finally saw him not as the janitor, not just as the millionaire, but as the man who proved that humility is stronger than hate. Days later, the headlines read, "Disgraced assistant arrested for fraud, the millionaire janitor speaks on forgiveness." Charles didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He went back to work the next morning, wearing his uniform, mop in hand, walking the same hallways where it all began. When an intern stopped him and said, "Mr. Bennett, you really don't have to do this anymore," Charles smiled and replied, "That's where you're wrong. You never stop doing what reminds you who you are." For a while, peace returned. The air felt lighter. But peace never lasts forever, not for men who've seen envy up close. One night, Charles stood by his window, city lights flickering below. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Static crackled on the line. Then a voice, a man's voice, calm, low, chilling. "Mr. Bennett. I believe we have something in common." Charles frowned. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled softly. "Let's just say I used to work with Helen. And she told me everything about you. She might be gone, but her plans aren't. Consider this, unfinished business." The line went dead. Charles stood there, phone trembling in his hand, the hum of the city echoing through the glass. Outside, in the distance, a dark car idled across the street. The engine purred softly, headlights dimmed. And then, slowly, the car drove off into the night. Helen Carter thought she could destroy a man's reputation. But in chasing revenge, she only destroyed herself. Yet in the shadows she left behind, darker forces stirred, ones that cared little for pride and more for power. Charles Bennett may have survived Helen's vengeance, but the battle for his legacy was only beginning.